So guys, today I'm doing a video on Spider-Man Miles Morales, the GTX 1050 Ti. We're going to be starting it off with 1080p on the very low settings. Alright, let's jump into it. Alright, starting off with 1080p on the very low settings. Game's doing a pretty good job getting 40 FPS right now at Central Park, with some dips into the mid to high 30s. The game isn't stuttering or lagging so far. It's running quite well, which is a pretty good start, to be honest. I know with other cards we do get some stuttering on those higher ends, so I'm sure with this card it will happen as well. But on the very low settings, the game is looking pretty decent. Looks very sharp for 1080p, and you're getting 40 FPS, which is definitely a playable experience. I think at this point I would go with a 30 FPS cap regardless. Just have that extra headroom in case of a heavier scene, and you can either use a controller or you can use a keyboard and mouse. So that's what I'm doing right here, and it's still a pretty decent experience. It's not the most fluid or the most responsive with keyboard and mouse, but it's still a pretty good time. Alright, VRAM is sitting at 3.8 gigs, so we're almost maxed out. This card only has 4 gigs, I believe, so we're getting pretty close to our VRAM limit. We only have like 140 megs left. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and enable FSR. Display, yep, looking good. Gonna enable FSR real quick, 2.0. I'm going to start it off with the quality preset. I've got the sharpness increased to 5 from 0, because the game does look a little bit blurry at 1080p with FSR, so I want to have some sharpness there to back it up. Alright, as you can see, when I pan the camera around Spidey, you can see a bit of a blurriness and a weird looking outer edge, which kind of ruins the look a little bit. This isn't really the case with native 1080p, but after all, it's not that big of a deal. It is still definitely playable, and it doesn't ruin the look too much. Alright, so when I'm moving super quickly, as you can see when I'm pulling myself with the webs, Spidey does get a little bit blurry as well. I have motion blur disabled, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to go double check that right now, but I'm pretty sure that I have it disabled. Graphics, and at the bottom, motion blur strength is at 0, so I do have it disabled, but it is still blurring quite badly. So if I go ahead and do it again, he's in focus, and you can see the whole screen just gets a little bit blurry, and this wasn't really the case at native 1080p. But again, not too big of a deal. It's still a pretty good looking game, and you're sitting in the low to mid 40s, so if you want to go with the 40 FPS cap, I guess you can do that. We are getting pretty close to the low 50s now though, so hopefully we can get 50 to 60 FPS with a more aggressive FSR setting, but I got a feeling that 40 to 30 FPS is where we're going to be hanging with this card. Alright, the blurriness is a bit more aggressive now at balance versus quality, but again, it's not too bad still. It is still definitely playable. Those cars are missing wheels, they're just floating there, very nice. And if you got a small screen, the game will look far better than what I'm seeing right here. I'm playing on a 27-inch screen, I believe, so the floors will stand out far more than a smaller screen, like a 21-inch or maybe 24-inch as well. So just keep that in mind. Alright, FPS is sitting in the low to mid 40s and spiking up into the high 40s. Again, not too different from the quality preset. It's still in the 40s, but I'm sure we can... Oh, there we go. Now we're hitting the mid to high 50s. That's interesting. Getting very close to that 60 FPS mark. What if I go higher? Got a pretty massive stutter right there though. Game just froze up quite aggressively. Looking at a wall, we're getting 70 FPS. Very nice. But yeah, 40 FPS seems to be where this guy wants to hang around in. And the FPS drops where you're sitting in the 50s and dropping down into the low 40s is pretty aggressive, and you're definitely going to feel that. So I would advise on capping the FPS to 30 and having a consistent experience. Alright, now we're using the low preset, and these are the settings for it. Very nice. Display is looking the same, no upscaling, so no FSR. Alright, I want to mention something. On my first initial boot of this game, the game crashed 4 to 5 times, and the only way I managed to fix it was by setting the settings to its default value of low instead of very low, and the game just started up fine. So that's something to keep in mind. The game did crash for me a couple of times, but after a while it started up and it's playing just fine. Now playing at low settings, we're getting a lot more stuttering compared to very low, and they're definitely far more obvious compared to very low as well.
Hey mom, yeah, but
FPS is sitting in the high 30s up to the low 40s, which is about the same as what we had at very low settings, maybe slightly worse. VRAM is sitting at 3.7 gigs, again very similar to what we had at low settings. We only have 300 megabytes left. And I want to go to the park. Let's go to the park. This isn't as intensive as the first game, but it is still very intensive, sitting in the low 30s. But going inside, I'm pretty sure it doesn't really affect you as much as just looking at it from the outside. Yeah, look at that. We're getting 40 FPS inside of the park, but when you're on the edge of it, that's when you see the most impact, sitting in the low 30s. So if I go back outside, as you can see, we're getting 31 FPS. 30 FPS, getting very close to our 30 FPS limit now. So far, the low settings is definitely far worse than the very low settings. Quality is obviously slightly increased, but the gameplay experience is definitely far worse. Getting more stuttering, getting very close to our 30 FPS limit. I'm going to go ahead and enable FSR now. I'm going to be using the quality preset. And I personally do like the native 1080p look more than FSR. Without anti-aliasing, of course. I don't really like the anti-aliasing look either. Kind of makes the game blurry. But so far we're getting 40 FPS. Gonna see if we can fall down to the mid 30s next to Central Park. And you know what? So far we're doing a pretty good job holding 40 FPS. I'll go through it. Almost getting 50 FPS, very close to it. So the safe bet, if you want to play at low settings, is to use FSR. Will keep you far away from that 30 FPS limit. Now I'm going to look for any stuttering or any lag spikes that we can feel. So far, it's felt quite fine. Definitely a lot worse at native 1080p compared to FSR, but I think it's still there in the background somewhere, you know? We're getting some micro stuttering here and there. Jumping right back into it with the medium settings. There we go, gotta scroll down real quick. And let's continue. Ooh, this is definitely feeling a little bit more stuttery than low. Already getting some massive FPS drops, it seems like. Dropping down into the low 30s. And this is in the city. Once we get next to Central Park, we're gonna be falling down into the 20s for sure. 31 FPS, I'm looking for it, but so far we're able to hold 30 FPS still at medium settings. But I wouldn't want to be at the limit of 30, you know, I want to have some extra headroom in case of a heavy scene, so we don't fall down into the 20s. So far medium settings is the biggest jump in terms of quality. Very low and low are very similar to each other. Obviously very low performed a little bit better in terms of the performance side of things. Now at medium settings we're getting some dips into the high 20s, which I saw coming. But the quality is definitely worth the FPS loss in my opinion. But I think ideally with this game though, if you want to play at native 1080p without FSR, play at the very low settings and get a 30 FPS cap going. But if you don't mind the FSR look at 1080p, then go ahead and play at medium settings, or even maybe high if it runs well enough. And use FSR with the quality preset. You can use Balanced as well, it's still definitely playable and looks decent enough, but I wouldn't go past that. Again, let's go ahead and enable FSR. Gonna be using the quality preset. Seems to be a pretty good sweet spot for quality and performance. The lowest I've seen it hit was around 28 FPS at native 1080p, but on average we're sitting at 30 FPS. And with FSR we're sitting in the high 30s up to the low 40s, so a pretty decent FPS jump, like around 10 FPS increase from what we had at native 1080p. Game is running quite well now with FSR. It's definitely saving this card from having to play at very low settings, I guess. Okay, so with the high settings, we are obviously going to be falling down into the 20s, since at medium settings we're sitting at the edge of 30, and already we're sitting in the mid 20s. So I'm going to go jump into the settings real quick. Graphics, and here we are, high settings. And obviously, upscale method is disabled as well. So I think we're going to be able to get 30 FPS occasionally with this card at high settings. But for the most part, we're going to be sitting in the mid to high 20s with some dips into the low 20s in those heavier scenes. The game is very stuttery though. It's very choppy, lagging every couple of seconds. Even though FPS is at 30, it is just not a good experience. Ooh, those dips down into the 20s feel awful. If I was going to guess, I think with FSR we can get a stable 30 going with this card. But I don't know if the quality loss is worth it at that point. If you want the best looking game, I think playing at low settings with a mix of medium settings sprinkled in there will be the best experience. Because using FSR, you are losing some quality obviously, and losing some sharpness and clarity as well. But in return, you're getting better reflections, better lighting, stuff like that. So it's a trade-off. Alright, good time to go ahead and enable FSR. I'm gonna go ahead and enable it right now. And with quality FSR, what are we getting? 24 FPS. Not much of an increase from what we had at native 1080p. But once we swing, we should see a pretty decent jump, right? Yeah, there we go. 30 FPS. Almost 40 FPS now. Wow, okay. This is the performance I was looking for. We are still getting pretty close to that 30 FPS limit as well. Sitting around 33 FPS, so I wouldn't be surprised if we fall down to the high 20s in those heavier scenes. Oh, there we go. We just fell into the high 20s as soon as I say that. Mid 20s still as well. Whoa. So yeah, I would avoid playing at the high settings for this card. I think everyone already knew that. Medium with FSR looks pretty good. Plays well as well. Low and very low settings, you can get away with playing at native 1080p. No FSR required. But very low settings ran the best, ran the smoothest, ran the most consistent. Alright, that's it for the video, guys. If you made it this far, appreciate you. As always, if you like what you see, and I like, for the channel as well. See you next time.